The people of Appalachia have a saying that outsiders rarely understand. They say the mountains remember everything. Every secret buried beneath the soil, every traveler who vanished without a trace, every strange sound carried through the endless forests after midnight. The Appalachian Mountains stretch for more than 2,000 miles across eastern North America, covering vast wilderness where entire valleys remain untouched by modern development and where old stories survive from one generation to the next. Most of these stories are dismissed as folklore, tales created to entertain children or explain the unknown. But there is one legend that continues to grow even in the modern age, a legend supported by hundreds of chilling reports from ordinary people who insist they witnessed something they can never explain. They call them the black-eyed things. No one knows exactly what they are. Some believe they are spirits. Others think they are something much older than any ghost story. What makes the reports so disturbing is not merely their appearance, but the terrifying consistency among witnesses who have never met each other and who often live hundreds of miles apart. Again and again, they describe pale figures appearing alone on remote roads, near isolated homes, abandoned gas stations, forgotten mountain trails, and lonely stretches of forest. Sometimes they look like children, sometimes teenagers, occasionally adults. Yet all of them share the same horrifying feature. Their eyes are completely black. No whites, no pupils, no irises. Just endless darkness staring back at whoever encounters them. One of the earliest modern reports emerged from a small Appalachian town hidden among the mountains of West Virginia. The town was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where front porches overlooked winding roads and dense forests surrounded every home. During the winter of 1998, a retired schoolteacher named Harold lived alone at the edge of town. Harold was not known for telling stories. Friends described him as practical, skeptical, and stubborn. He had spent 40 years teaching history and rarely entertained anything supernatural. On a freezing December night, shortly after a heavy snowstorm, Harold was sitting in his living room reading a book when he heard 3 knocks on his front door. The sound immediately struck him as strange. It was nearly 11 at night. Snow covered the roads, and temperatures had fallen well below freezing. Expecting a neighbor in need of help, he approached the door and looked through the small window beside it. Standing on his porch were 2 children. They appeared to be around 10 or 11 years old. Both wore dark clothing unsuitable for the weather. Neither had a coat despite the bitter cold. Harold opened the door slightly and asked whether they needed assistance. The children stood motionless. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then one finally answered in a calm voice. "We need to come inside." Harold felt an odd sensation he would later struggle to describe. It was not fear at first. It was more like a warning. Something deep within him insisted that opening the door further would be a mistake. He asked where their parents were. The children did not answer. Instead, they repeated the same sentence. "We need to come inside." Harold noticed that neither child blinked. Their faces remained expressionless, and they slowly lifted their heads. What he saw made his blood run cold. Their eyes were entirely black. Harold immediately stepped backward and slammed the door shut. Within seconds, he heard another knock, then another, then another. Not loud, not aggressive, slow and deliberate. He later claimed the knocking continued for nearly 20 minutes before finally stopping. The next morning, he discovered no footprints in the snow leading to or from his porch. The untouched snowfield stretched in every direction. Whatever had visited his home left no evidence it had ever been there. Harold told only a few close friends about the incident because he feared being ridiculed. Years later, after his death, one of those friends shared the story publicly and was shocked when dozens of people responded with nearly identical experiences. Similar reports began appearing across Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, and deep within the remote communities scattered throughout the Appalachian Mountains. A truck driver traveling through eastern Kentucky described encountering 2 black-eyed children standing beside an abandoned coal road shortly after midnight. According to his account, the children appeared suddenly in his headlights despite there being no nearby homes for miles. Concerned, he slowed his vehicle and prepared to offer assistance. As he approached, both figures turned toward him in perfect unison. Their faces seemed unnaturally pale beneath the glow of his headlights. Before he could stop, he noticed their eyes. They were completely black. A wave of terror struck him so intensely that he accelerated without thinking. In later interviews, he claimed he had faced dangerous storms, highway accidents, and armed robberies during his career, but had never experienced fear comparable to what he felt during those few seconds. Another report came from a nurse driving home after a late shift in rural Tennessee. She stopped at a small convenience store shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning. The parking lot was empty except for a teenage boy standing near the entrance. He appeared nervous and repeatedly glanced toward the road. As she exited the store, the boy approached and politely asked for a ride. Something about his behavior seemed unusual. His speech sounded rehearsed, almost mechanical. The nurse hesitated and looked more closely at him. When the boy raised his head, she saw eyes as black as polished stone. She immediately entered her car and locked the doors. According to her account, the teenager simply stood there staring through the windshield, as though waiting for permission to enter. Only after she started the engine did he slowly walk away into the darkness beyond the parking lot lights. Witnesses frequently describe a strange pattern in these encounters. The entities rarely force their way into homes or vehicles. Instead, they ask for permission. They request entry. They insist on being invited inside. Researchers studying the phenomenon have noted similarities between this behavior and ancient folklore involving supernatural beings that require consent before crossing certain boundaries. Throughout Appalachian history, stories have circulated about spirits, witches, and other entities unable to enter a home unless welcomed. Some investigators believe the black-eyed beings represent a modern version of these older legends. Others argue the resemblance is coincidental. Whatever the explanation may be, countless witnesses report the same unsettling detail. The black-eyed figures never simply enter. They ask, they wait, and they seem to become increasingly persistent if denied. One particularly disturbing account emerged from western North Carolina. A family living near the edge of a national forest reported repeated visits over several months. The first incident occurred when their teenage daughter noticed a child standing among the trees beyond their backyard. The child appeared around 8 years old and remained completely motionless for nearly an hour. Assuming the youngster was lost, the family searched the area but found nobody. Over the following weeks, the figure appeared repeatedly, always at dusk and always in roughly the same location. One evening, the father decided to approach. As he crossed the yard, the child stepped forward from the shadows. The father immediately noticed the pale skin and dark clothing. Then the child looked directly at him. The eyes were entirely black. The father later admitted that every instinct urged him to run. Instead, he stood frozen as the figure calmly asked whether it could come inside the house. Terrified, he refused. The child remained silent for several moments before turning and walking into the forest. The family moved away less than a year later. Their former home reportedly remains abandoned. Stories like these spread rapidly throughout Appalachia, especially in isolated communities where unusual experiences are often shared quietly among neighbors. Many residents dismiss the accounts as exaggerations, yet others insist something genuine lies behind the legend. Several psychologists have suggested that reports of black-eyed entities may stem from misidentification, heightened anxiety, sleep deprivation, or cultural influence. According to this theory, once people become familiar with a legend, they may interpret ordinary encounters through that lens. However, critics of this explanation point out that many witnesses claim they had never heard of black-eyed beings before their experiences. In numerous cases, the descriptions remain remarkably consistent despite occurring in different states and among people from vastly different backgrounds. Hunters, teachers, police officers, nurses, truck drivers, and retirees all tell similar stories. Most insist they gained nothing by sharing them and often delayed speaking publicly for years out of fear of ridicule. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the phenomenon is the emotional response reported by witnesses. Again and again, they describe overwhelming dread appearing before they even notice the eyes. Many say that for years after the stories of the black-eyed things began spreading across Appalachia, most people treated them as little more than strange campfire tales. Yet among those who had actually experienced encounters, the fear never faded. Many witnesses admitted they could still remember every detail decades later, from the sound of the voice to the feeling of dread that settled over them before they ever saw the eyes. One of the most disturbing investigations into the phenomenon began when a freelance journalist named Ethan Mercer decided to collect reports from across the Appalachian region. Ethan had spent years documenting folklore and unexplained events, and he initially approached the black-eyed things with skepticism. He believed there was likely a simple explanation hidden beneath exaggeration and internet rumors. His plan was straightforward: travel through remote mountain communities, interview witnesses, compare stories, and uncover the truth. What he discovered instead left him questioning everything he thought he knew. During the spring of 2017, Ethan spent several months traveling through West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina. He spoke with dozens of witnesses. What surprised him most was not the stories themselves, but how similar they were. Many witnesses had never heard of each other. Some had never even heard the term black-eyed things before describing their experiences. Yet the details remained remarkably consistent. Pale skin, dark clothing, emotionless voices, requests to enter homes or vehicles, and always the eyes, entirely black. One elderly woman living near the Virginia border described hearing a knock on her door shortly after midnight. Through the peephole, she saw what appeared to be a teenage girl standing alone on the porch. The girl calmly asked to come inside and use the telephone. The woman explained that she felt an overwhelming sense of danger before she ever noticed the eyes. When she refused the request, the girl remained motionless for nearly 10 minutes before disappearing. Another witness, a retired coal miner from eastern Kentucky, described seeing 3 black-eyed children standing beside an abandoned railroad track. He watched them through binoculars while hunting deer. According to his account, the children appeared completely still for nearly an hour. Then all 3 suddenly turned toward his position despite being hundreds of yards away. Terrified, he left the area immediately. Ethan filled notebooks with testimonies. The more stories he collected, the more unsettled he became. Eventually, he noticed a curious pattern. A significant number of sightings appeared concentrated around abandoned mining regions and remote sections of forest where local legends already spoke of strange activity. Several witnesses independently mentioned an old valley hidden deep within the mountains of eastern Kentucky. Locals referred to it simply as Hollow Creek. The valley had once supported a small mining settlement during the late 19th century. After a series of disasters, including cave-ins, accidents, and unexplained disappearances, the town gradually emptied. By the 1940s, it was essentially abandoned. Even today, few people visit the area. Roads leading into the valley are poorly maintained. Cell phone reception is nearly non-existent, and thick forests cover much of the landscape. Ethan became intrigued when multiple witnesses claimed to have encountered black-eyed figures near Hollow Creek. Some described seeing them standing among the trees. Others reported knocks on cabin doors. A few hunters claimed they had spotted pale figures watching from ridgelines before vanishing into the forest. Hoping to investigate further, Ethan traveled to the valley during the autumn of 2017. Local residents strongly advised against spending the night there. Most refused to discuss the subject in detail. One elderly man simply told him, "If something knocks after dark, don't answer." Ethan assumed the warning was part of the local folklore. He drove into the valley late one afternoon and established camp near the ruins of the old mining settlement. The remains of several stone foundations still stood among the trees. Rusted mining equipment lay scattered across the landscape. As darkness settled over the valley, an unusual silence seemed to consume the forest. Ethan later wrote that he had spent countless nights outdoors throughout his career, but had never experienced anything quite like Hollow Creek. The usual sounds of insects and wildlife seemed strangely absent. Around 11 o'clock, he began recording audio notes inside his tent. Everything remained quiet until shortly after midnight. That was when he heard the first knock. At first, he assumed a branch had struck a nearby tree. Then it came again. 3 slow knocks. Deliberate, evenly spaced. The sound appeared to originate from outside the tent. Ethan switched on a flashlight and listened carefully. For nearly a minute, nothing happened. Then came 3 more knocks. This time closer. He stepped outside and swept the flashlight across the darkness. The forest appeared empty. No movement, no animals, no people. He returned to the tent, slightly unnerved but unwilling to jump to conclusions. 5 minutes later, he heard a voice. Soft, calm, childlike. Can you help us? Ethan froze. The voice came from somewhere beyond the trees. He called out, asking who was there. No response followed. Instead, he heard footsteps moving slowly through the leaves. Grabbing his flashlight, he stepped outside once again. The beam illuminated a small figure standing approximately 50 yards away among the trees. The figure appeared to be a child. Ethan immediately felt the same sensation described by so many witnesses during his interviews. A powerful instinct urging him to leave. The child did not move. It simply stood there. Ethan later admitted that curiosity briefly overcame fear. He raised his flashlight toward the figure and took several steps forward. The child slowly lifted its head. Even from a distance, Ethan could see the eyes. 2 black voids reflecting no light whatsoever. Panic struck him instantly. He stumbled backward and nearly dropped the flashlight. When he looked again, the figure was gone. The forest stood empty. Ethan packed his equipment and left the valley before sunrise. Although he attempted to rationalize the experience afterward, his writings reveal increasing uncertainty. He repeatedly emphasized that the fear he experienced felt unlike anything he had ever known. Several months later, he returned to Hollow Creek with additional investigators and recording equipment. During this second expedition, strange events reportedly occurred throughout the night. Cameras malfunctioned without explanation. Batteries drained unexpectedly. Audio recorders captured unexplained knocking sounds. Shortly before dawn, one investigator claimed to see multiple figures standing along a nearby ridgeline. By the time others turned to look, the figures had vanished. The team never returned. Ethan eventually published his findings, but rather than providing answers, the investigation raised even more questions. As news of the Hollow Creek encounters spread, additional witnesses came forward. Some claimed family members had warned them about black-eyed figures long before the phenomenon became widely known online. According to these stories, similar entities had appeared in Appalachian folklore for generations under different names. Certain mountain communities spoke of pale visitors who arrived after dark seeking permission to enter homes. Others described wandering spirits whose eyes resembled empty shadows. While details varied, the similarities proved difficult to ignore. Paranormal researchers began exploring whether the modern black-eyed things might represent a continuation of much older legends. Skeptics remained unconvinced. They argued that folklore naturally evolves over time and that people often reshape memories to fit popular narratives. Yet even skeptics acknowledged the unusual consistency of witness testimony. One aspect continued appearing in nearly every account. The entities never behaved aggressively at first. They asked. They waited. They sought permission. Why this pattern exists remains one of the greatest mysteries surrounding the phenomenon. Some researchers believe it reflects ancient beliefs regarding thresholds and spiritual boundaries. Throughout many cultures, supernatural beings are said to require invitation before entering private spaces. Whether symbolic or literal, the rule appears deeply embedded within countless traditions. Witnesses of black-eyed encounters frequently report that refusing entry ends the interaction, though not always immediately. In some cases, the figures remain nearby for extended periods, watching silently before eventually leaving. The most chilling reports involve repeated visits. Several families across Appalachia have claimed that black-eyed figures returned multiple times over weeks or even months. One family living in a remote section of Tennessee described hearing knocks at their door on 3 separate occasions. Each time, they discovered a pale child